A former SEAL veteran and his loyal K9 were just passing through a forgotten Montana town when the dog suddenly refused to leave an abandoned school bought for only $39. For 40 years, the town believed a beloved principal had stolen from children and disappeared. But what Titan smelled beneath that school would uncover hidden tunnels, missing millions, buried evidence, and a truth powerful people had spent decades trying to hide. As the investigation grew deeper, the danger became deadly, and someone was willing to burn the school to keep the secret alive. What happened next would restore an innocent woman's honor, give children back their future, and prove that sometimes God works through the most unexpected heroes. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and join SEAL K9 Horizon for more incredible stories. The road into Willow Creek stretched across the Montana plains beneath a cold autumn sky, quiet enough that the sound of the truck tires against the pavement seemed louder than it should have been. Mason Reed had driven through hundreds of towns like this since leaving the Navy, but something about Willow Creek felt different before he ever saw the sign. At 45, Mason carried himself like a man still shaped by war, even after the war had taken his uniform away. He was broad-shouldered, athletic, clean-shaven, with a masculine angular face, a strong jawline, blue-gray eyes, and dark brown hair cut in a neat undercut that made him look disciplined even after weeks on the road. A small scar near his left temple and the slight stiffness in his right knee were the only visible signs of the mission in Afghanistan that ended his career as a Navy SEAL. He still wore a green camouflage long-sleeve uniform with matching tactical pants, a dark tactical belt with utility pouches, tan military boots, and a stainless steel watch with a black dial, not because he was trying to look like a soldier, but because after losing the teams, the missions, and the purpose that had once defined him, that clothing was one of the few things that still made him feel like himself. Beside him sat Titan, the only partner Mason trusted without hesitation. Titan was an 8-year-old retired military K9 German Shepherd, larger than most dogs of his breed, with a strong chest, black and dark tan fur, amber eyes, and a small scar on his right ear. An old brown leather collar with a brass name tag rested against his thick neck. Titan rarely barked without reason, rarely wasted energy, and almost never reacted to anything unless something truly mattered. In Afghanistan, he had found explosives, warned men before ambushes, and once refused to leave a collapsed building until Mason discovered a wounded soldier beneath the rubble. Since then, Mason had learned not to question the dog's instincts. He might not always understand them at first, but Titan usually knew something before anyone else did. Willow Creek appeared just before sunset, a small town of old brick storefronts, quiet porches, faded flags, and streets that looked as if life had slowly drained out of them over many years. Mason intended to pass through, maybe buy fuel, maybe find a place to park for the night, but Titan suddenly lifted his head. His ears rose sharply. His body became still in a way Mason recognized immediately. Mason slowed the truck and followed the dog's gaze through the windshield. At first, he saw only an empty stretch of road, then a rusted fence, then the outline of a large building sitting alone at the edge of town. It was an old school. Willow Creek Elementary stood behind the fence like a memory nobody wanted to touch. Its windows were broken, its roof sagged in places, and weeds had swallowed the sidewalks leading to the front doors. A playground sat beside it, silent and rotten, with one swing hanging crooked from a single chain. The school sign was still there, but the letters were faded and rusted almost beyond recognition. Titan stared past all of it, not at the main entrance, not at the playground, but toward the old library wing on the left side of the building. Mason pulled onto the shoulder. The second he opened the door, Titan jumped down and walked straight toward the fence. He did not sniff the weeds or circle the property like a curious dog. He went directly to one spot and stopped, staring through the metal bars at the library windows. Mason stood behind him and felt an uneasiness he could not explain. The place looked abandoned, but not empty. It felt like a room where someone had stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence and never returned to finish it. A man from the small gas station across the road noticed Mason watching. He was in his late 60s, thin and weathered with a gray beard, sunken cheeks, tired brown eyes, and a faded work cap pulled low over thinning silver hair. He had the manner of a local who knew everyone's business, but had learned not to speak too much unless asked. "Nobody goes near that school anymore," he said, crossing the road slowly with a coffee cup in his hand. "Been closed almost 40 years. Mason asked what happened. The old man looked toward the building and hesitated. "Principal disappeared. Money disappeared too. Her name was Eleanor Price. Folks said she stole education funds and ran." His voice carried the story, but not full belief. Mason heard that difference. Men who believed a thing completely didn't pause before saying it. The old man added that Eleanor had once been respected, even loved by some, but after the accusation, the town turned on her quickly. The school lost funding, families left, children were sent to other districts, and eventually the building was abandoned. "Bad memories cost more than repairs," the man muttered before walking away. Then Titan made a sound that froze Mason where he stood. It was not a bark or a growl. It was a low, aching whine from deep in his chest, the kind Mason had heard only once before, years earlier, when Titan found that wounded soldier trapped beneath concrete overseas. The dog pressed his nose against the rusted fence and stared at the library as if something behind those walls had been waiting for someone to come back. Mason looked at the broken windows, the dead playground, the darkening sky above the school, and for one strange moment, the whole place seemed less like an abandoned building and more like a witness that had never been allowed to speak. Mason did not believe in ghosts. He believed in training, instinct, evidence, and the quiet signals most people ignored. But standing there beside Titan, he felt something close to faith, not supernatural, not dramatic, just the feeling that truth had weight, and sometimes even a dog could sense where it had been buried. The next morning, Mason learned the county was auctioning the school property. The sale was being held in a plain county office with fluorescent lights, folding chairs, and a clerk who looked as if he expected the process to end without a single bid. The property came with unpaid taxes, structural damage, possible asbestos in the older sections, insurance complications, and full legal liability for whoever took ownership. That explained the opening bid. $39. No one raised a hand. A woman in the back whispered something and laughed under her breath. Mason sat quietly with Titan lying beside his chair, but the dog remained alert, amber eyes watching the room as if waiting for Mason to understand what had already been decided. The clerk repeated the number. Still, no one moved. Mason did not consider himself impulsive. Years in the teams had trained hesitation out of him only when action was necessary. Yet, something about the school, Titan's reaction, and the old man's uncertain voice stayed in his mind. Finally, Mason raised his hand. "I'll take it." The room turned toward him. The clerk blinked and asked if he understood the risk. Mason looked down at Titan, then back at the clerk. "Probably not all of it," he said, "but enough." A few signatures later, Willow Creek Elementary belonged to him for $39. That evening, Mason returned with flashlights, gloves, trash bags, and a small toolbox. Inside, the school smelled of dust, damp wood, old paper, and time. Classrooms sat exactly as they had been left, with small desks in crooked rows, faded alphabet posters peeling from the walls, and art projects curled like dead leaves on bulletin boards. In the principal's office, Mason found a nameplate lying face down in a drawer. Eleanor Price. He picked it up carefully and studied the scratched brass letters. The office did not look like the office of someone who had stolen from children. There were no signs of greed, no hidden luxury, no trophies of selfishness, just student photographs, worn books, thank you cards, and old files stacked with the neatness of a woman who had cared about order because children depended on it. Mason felt the first real crack in the town's story form inside him. Titan did not stay in the office. Again and again he returned to the library. Mason followed him through the dark hallway, past classroom doors and broken lockers, until they entered the long room filled with abandoned shelves. Dust covered everything. Books leaned under their own weight. The last light of day came through cracked windows in pale strips across the floor. Titan moved slowly between the aisles, nose low, ears forward, body tense. He passed shelf after shelf until he reached the back wall, where a large wooden bookcase stood locked in place by rusted metal brackets. It was heavier than the others and looked older, almost as though it had been built not to hold books, but to hide something behind it. Titan stopped directly in front of it and scratched once. Mason crouched beside him. "There?" Titan scratched again, harder this time, claws scraping against the wood. Mason examined the brackets, then the base of the shelf, then the wall around it. Near the bottom, through a narrow gap, he felt a faint stream of cold air touch his gloved fingers. The hair at the back of his neck rose. A bookshelf should not breathe. Titan suddenly began clawing at the base with fierce urgency, scattering dust across the floor. Mason aimed his flashlight into the gap and saw darkness behind the shelf, not shadow from the room, but empty space. Outside, the last sunlight disappeared behind Willow Creek, and the school settled into a silence so deep it seemed to listen back. Mason stayed crouched beside Titan, staring into the hidden gap behind the locked bookcase. Whatever Eleanor Price had known, whatever the town had chosen to believe, whatever had drawn Titan to this forgotten school, it was not gone. It was still here, behind the library wall, waiting after nearly 40 years. And Titan had just found the first door. Mason remained crouched beside the massive bookshelf long after darkness settled outside Willow Creek Elementary. The beam from his flashlight disappeared into the narrow gap behind the wood, revealing only darkness and empty space beyond. Titan continued scratching at the base with growing urgency, his claws sending dust and splinters across the floor. Mason placed a hand on the dog's shoulder, feeling the tension beneath the thick black and tan fur. Titan immediately stopped scratching but kept staring at the shelf. The German Shepherd's amber eyes never left it. Mason had learned years ago that Titan never became obsessed with something without reason. Curiosity could be trained into a dog. Instinct could not. The rusted lock gave way after several minutes of effort. The metal snapped with a sharp crack that echoed through the abandoned library. Mason carefully removed the bracket securing the shelf to the wall. The structure was far heavier than he expected. Whoever had placed it there had not intended for it to be moved easily. He pushed against it. The shelf shifted only slightly. He pushed again. This time it scraped across the floor, revealing a hidden recess built directly into the wall behind it. The cavity was smaller than he imagined, roughly 4 feet wide and 3 feet tall, sealed from view for decades. Dust coated everything inside, yet the contents remained remarkably preserved. Mason directed the flashlight beam into the opening. A leather-bound journal sat near the front. Beside it rested several folders tied together with faded string. Beneath them lay a stack of photographs, an old cassette tape inside a protective case, and a rolled blueprint secured with a rubber band that had become brittle with age. Titan immediately stepped forward. The dog sniffed the opening carefully. Then something unusual happened. Titan sat down, not because he had finished investigating, because he seemed satisfied, almost as though he had finally located the thing he had been searching for since arriving in town. Mason removed the journal first. Inside the cover was a name written in neat blue ink: Eleanor Price. For a moment, Mason simply stared at the handwriting. The woman accused of stealing from children suddenly felt real. Not a rumor, not a story. A person. He carried everything to a nearby table in the library and began examining the contents one item at a time. The journal appeared to be Eleanor's personal record. The first pages contained ordinary entries about students, school events, fundraising activities, and teacher meetings. As he turned more pages, the tone gradually changed. Eleanor began mentioning concerns about missing money. Certain educational grants never seemed to reach the students they were intended to help. Requests for repairs were approved on paper, but never completed. Supplies that should have arrived never appeared. Mason found himself picturing Eleanor as he read. The photographs helped. In nearly every image, she appeared surrounded by children. Eleanor Price had been a woman in her early 50s when the photos were taken. She stood around 5'6" with a slender frame, warm hazel eyes, and shoulder-length light brown hair that curled slightly at the ends. Her face carried the kind of gentle intelligence often seen in lifelong educators. There was nothing flashy about her appearance. She wore modest cardigans, practical skirts, and comfortable shoes. Yet something in her smile stood out. It was genuine, the sort of smile that belonged to someone who cared deeply about other people. Mason had spent years reading faces. He knew appearances could deceive. But the woman in those photographs looked nothing like the thief Willow Creek remembered. The next folder contained financial records, several government grants, school improvement funds, scholarship allocations, programs intended for low-income students. As Mason compared the paperwork, inconsistencies began appearing immediately. Numbers changed, amounts vanished, approvals existed without evidence of completed projects. The pattern repeated over and over. Someone had been siphoning money away from the school. A lot of money. Far more than a desperate principal could have hidden alone. Titan wandered away from the table. Mason barely noticed. His attention remained fixed on the documents. The deeper he looked, the less believable the town's version of events became. Then he found the cassette tape. An old cassette player sat, abandoned in the principal's office. After nearly an hour of cleaning dust from the machine and replacing corroded batteries, Mason finally got it working. The tape began with static. Several seconds passed. Then a woman's voice emerged, soft and tired, determined. "If someone finds this recording," the tape crackled. The voice returned. "My name is Eleanor Price." Mason leaned closer. The recording quality was poor, but understandable. Eleanor continued speaking. "I don't know how much time I have left." A chill moved through Mason. That was not how guilty people sounded. The tape skipped. Static interrupted several words. Then another sentence emerged. "They are not stealing from the school." The recording crackled. "They are stealing from the children." Mason sat completely still. The words carried far more weight than the rumors he had heard in town. This was not a woman defending her reputation. This sounded like someone trying to protect something larger than herself. Re-hook. As the tape continued playing, Titan suddenly appeared in the doorway of the principal's office. The dog wasn't looking at Mason. He wasn't looking at the recorder. He was staring down the dark hallway beyond the office. Every muscle in his body had become rigid. His ears pointed forward. A low growl escaped his throat. Mason immediately stood. The hallway was empty, silent. Yet Titan continued staring into the darkness as if watching someone who wasn't there. The moment lasted only a few seconds. Then the dog relaxed. The growl stopped. Titan turned and walked away. But the uneasy feeling remained. For reasons he couldn't explain, Mason found himself wondering whether Eleanor had ever stood in that same office 40 years earlier, feeling exactly the same way. The tape resumed. Eleanor mentioned financial records disappearing, meetings held behind closed doors, pressure from influential people within the town. Several names appeared throughout the recording, but unfortunately the damaged tape swallowed many of them beneath static. One sentence survived clearly. "I trusted the wrong people." Another burst of interference followed. Then silence. The recording ended abruptly. No conclusion, no confession, no explanation, just unanswered questions. Mason returned to the library carrying the blueprint he had discovered earlier. Upon unrolling it, he realized it was not actually a blueprint. It was a map, a detailed floor plan of Willow Creek Elementary. Most rooms appeared ordinary: classrooms, storage areas, administrative offices. Yet one location immediately stood out: a red circle drawn by hand, directly beneath the school auditorium. Several notes surrounded it. Most had faded beyond recognition. Only a few words remained visible. Records, evidence, and one final phrase: "If anything happens." The rest disappeared beneath water damage. Mason studied the map carefully. The red circle sat beneath the stage area inside the auditorium, a location nobody would casually inspect. His pulse quickened slightly. If Eleanor truly feared for her safety, perhaps the hidden recess behind the bookshelf had only been the beginning. Perhaps she had hidden additional evidence somewhere else. Titan seemed to agree. The dog had returned to wandering the building, yet every few minutes he drifted toward the auditorium, again and again and again. Near midnight, Mason finally followed him. The auditorium occupied the center of the school. Rows of dusty seats faced a stage framed by faded red curtains. Moonlight entered through high windows, creating long shadows across the floor. Titan ignored the seating area entirely. Instead, he walked directly onto the stage. The German Shepherd lowered his nose, sniffed once, twice, then stopped. Mason watched silently. Titan turned in a slow circle, then sat down directly in the center of the wooden stage, waiting, watching, refusing to move. The behavior felt familiar. This was exactly how Titan had acted in the library before finding the hidden compartment. Mason climbed onto the stage and examined the floorboards. At first he noticed nothing unusual. Then his flashlight caught something, a slight difference in the wood grain, a seam, small, almost invisible, but definitely there. The stage floor wasn't entirely solid. Part of it had been modified, hidden, concealed. Mason knelt beside the seam while Titan remained seated nearby. The dog never looked away. Whatever Titan had smelled behind the bookshelf was connected to this place. Mason could feel it, beneath them, hidden somewhere under the stage, waiting for someone willing to keep digging. And as the cold Montana wind rattled the windows of the abandoned school, Mason realized the mystery of Eleanor Price had only just begun. The auditorium remained silent except for the sound of the wind pressing against the old windows. Mason knelt beside the faint seam hidden in the stage floor while Titan sat nearby, watching with unwavering focus. The German Shepherd had not moved in nearly 10 minutes. His ears remained upright, his amber eyes fixed on the exact spot beneath Mason's flashlight. The behavior reminded Mason of countless moments overseas when Titan had refused to leave an area until every possible clue had been uncovered. Unfortunately, the late hour and decades of accumulated dust made it impossible to investigate further that night. Mason marked the location with a piece of tape and finally convinced Titan to leave the auditorium. Even then, the dog looked back twice before following him out. Whatever lay beneath that stage was important. Titan seemed absolutely certain of it. The next morning, Mason woke in the cab of his truck parked outside the school. The sky hung low and gray above Willow Creek, and a cold wind carried the smell of approaching rain. He spent the first hour reviewing Eleanor Price's journal while drinking black coffee from a thermos. The more he read, the less the official story made sense. Eleanor had documented nearly everything: school fundraisers, teacher meetings, student achievements, notes about struggling families, pages filled with reminders to purchase winter coats for children who could not afford them. One entry described how she had quietly paid for lunch programs out of her own salary when district funding arrived late. Another detailed a scholarship fund she personally organized to help graduating students attend college. None of it matched the image of a woman willing to steal from children and disappear. Several names appeared repeatedly throughout the journal, but one name appeared more than any other: Grace Holloway. Eleanor mentioned her as a trusted friend, a confidant, someone who knew what was happening inside the school. Mason folded the journal closed. If anyone could tell him who Eleanor really was, it would be Grace. Finding her proved surprisingly easy. When Mason asked around town, several people pointed him toward a small white house near the edge of Willow Creek. The property was modest but well cared for. Flowers lined the front porch despite the approaching winter. Wind chimes hung beside the door, producing soft metallic notes whenever the breeze passed through. The woman who answered the door looked exactly like someone who had spent her life helping children. Grace Holloway was 72 years old, slender and slightly stooped with age, but there was still strength in the way she carried herself. Her silver-white hair rested neatly on her shoulders. Her pale blue eyes remained remarkably sharp. Deep lines crossed her face, but they seemed earned through decades of smiles rather than bitterness. When Mason introduced himself and mentioned Eleanor Price, something changed in her expression. Not fear, relief, as though she had been waiting years for someone to finally ask the right questions. She invited him inside. Titan followed quietly. The living room contained photographs covering nearly every wall: school events, graduation ceremonies, sports teams, children posing with teachers. Grace noticed Mason studying them. 40 years of teaching, she said softly. It's hard to throw away memories like that. Mason nodded. I found some things inside the school. Grace remained silent. Then he placed Eleanor's journal on the table. For several seconds, Grace simply stared at it, her eyes filled with emotion. I never thought I'd see that again. The next 2 hours changed everything Mason thought he knew about the case. Grace spoke slowly at first, but once she began, the memories seemed impossible to stop. She described Eleanor as one of the kindest people she had ever known. Eleanor had devoted nearly her entire life to helping children. She purchased books with her own money. She quietly paid lunch debts for struggling families. Every winter, she organized coat drives for students who arrived at school wearing thin jackets in freezing weather. Several former students who eventually attended college had done so only because Eleanor helped them find scholarships. Grace shook her head when Mason mentioned the accusations. "Eleanor stealing from children," she said. "That's like accusing a firefighter of loving fire." The certainty in her voice carried weight, not blind loyalty, conviction. The conviction of someone who had known another human being deeply. According to Grace, everything changed during the final months before Eleanor disappeared. The principal became worried, distracted, careful about who she trusted. She often stayed late after school reviewing financial records. She stopped discussing certain matters in public. Several influential people in town began visiting the school more frequently. Then, one day, Eleanor vanished. Within 48 hours, rumors spread across Willow Creek. Money was missing. Eleanor had fled. Case closed. The speed of it had always bothered Grace, almost as if someone had prepared the story before Eleanor disappeared. As Grace finished speaking, Titan suddenly rose from the floor. The dog walked across the room toward an old bookshelf in the corner. Not a modern shelf, an antique one. Dust covered most of its contents. Titan stopped in front of a framed photograph and stared. Grace followed his gaze. Then her expression changed. For the first time that day, she looked genuinely shaken. The photograph showed a school fundraiser held more than 40 years earlier. Eleanor stood at the center, smiling beside dozens of children. But Grace wasn't looking at Eleanor. She was staring at a man standing several feet behind her, a man partially hidden in the crowd. "That's strange," Grace whispered. "What is?" "I haven't thought about him in years." Mason looked closer. The man wore a dark suit. His face was partially obscured, yet something about the image felt important. Grace lowered herself into a chair. "That man started showing up shortly before Eleanor disappeared." The room suddenly felt colder. The conversation continued long into the afternoon. Eventually, Grace disappeared into another room and returned carrying an old wooden box. Inside were letters, photographs, newspaper clippings, school records, items she had kept for decades. Near the bottom rested a sealed envelope. The paper had yellowed with age. Eleanor's handwriting appeared on the front. Grace carefully handed it to Mason. "She gave me this 3 days before she disappeared." "Why didn't you open it?" Grace smiled sadly. "Because she told me not to." The envelope remained sealed after 40 years. Mason carefully opened it. Inside lay a single handwritten letter. The paper trembled slightly in his hands as he read. Most of the message focused on protecting students, protecting the school, protecting the truth. Then he reached the final paragraph. His heartbeat quickened. 3 words stood out immediately. "A room beneath," Mason continued reading. "A room beneath the children's stage." The phrase matched the map, matched Titan's behavior, matched the seam hidden beneath the auditorium. Eleanor had known exactly where evidence was hidden, and she had tried to leave directions for someone she trusted. Grace watched him carefully. "Do you know what it means?" "I think I'm starting to." Before leaving, Mason asked one final question. "Did Eleanor ever seem afraid?" Grace considered the question, then nodded. "Not for herself." Mason waited. Grace looked toward the old school visible through her front window. "For the children." The answer lingered in Mason's mind, all the way back to Willow Creek Elementary. Night had already fallen by the time he arrived. The school stood dark against the Montana sky. Titan jumped from the truck before Mason even opened his own door. The dog headed straight for the auditorium, not running, not excited, purposeful. Mason followed carrying flashlights and tools. Inside, dust drifted through the beams of light. Rows of empty seats watched silently from the darkness. Titan climbed onto the stage and returned to the exact spot where he had sat the previous night. The German shepherd lowered his nose, sniffed once, then pawed the floor. Mason examined the seam again. This time he noticed something new, a small metal ring hidden beneath years of dirt and old paint, almost invisible. His pulse quickened. The ring sat flush against a rectangular section of wood. Not a repair, not damage. A door, a concealed door, carefully hidden beneath the stage. Mason gripped the metal ring and pulled. At first, nothing happened. Then the wooden panel shifted slightly. Dust rose into the air. Titan immediately stepped forward. His ears rose. His tail became rigid. The hidden section lifted another inch. Darkness waited beneath it. Cold air drifted upward from below. Stared into the opening. After 40 years of silence, Willow Creek Elementary had finally begun revealing its secrets. And beneath the children's stage, exactly where Eleanor Price had promised, something had been waiting all along. The hidden door beneath the auditorium stage resisted Mason's first pull, as if the school itself had spent 40 years learning how to keep its secrets. Dust rose from the seams in pale clouds, drifting through the flashlight beam, while Titan stood close enough that Mason could feel the dog's breathing against his leg. The old German shepherd was completely still now, no longer scratching, no longer pacing, only watching the opening with a kind of focused patience Mason had seen in war zones when Titan knew something important was ahead. Mason tightened his grip on the iron ring and pulled again. This time, the wooden panel shifted with a deep groan, the sound rolling through the empty auditorium like a warning. Cold air rose from below, carrying the smell of damp concrete, old paper, rusted metal, and time. Mason waited a moment before moving. Years of training had taught him that hidden spaces were never entered casually. He checked the edges of the opening, tested the wood with his boot, then lowered the flashlight into the darkness. A narrow stairway disappeared beneath the stage, its steps coated in dust but still intact. "Stay close," Mason said quietly. Titan stepped forward before the words had fully left his mouth. The stairway led down into an old service corridor beneath Willow Creek Elementary. The walls were concrete, stained with moisture and age. Rusted pipes ran along the ceiling. In some places, the floor was packed earth, in others, cracked cement. Mason moved slowly, one hand on the wall, one hand gripping the flashlight. His injured knee complained with each step downward, sending a familiar ache through his leg, but he ignored it. Pain had become part of his life after Afghanistan, like weather or memory. It came and went. It never got to decide his direction. Titan walked ahead by only a few feet, nose low, body tense, ears forward. The dog did not seem frightened, but the caution in his movements told Mason the tunnel was not merely empty space. Something had passed through here once, maybe many times. As they reached the bottom, the corridor widened into a room hidden beneath the auditorium stage. Mason stopped at the entrance. What he saw made the air leave his lungs. Old metal cabinets lined one wall. Cardboard boxes sat stacked in rows. Several wooden crates had collapsed under their own weight, spilling folders and papers across the floor. It was not a storage room by accident. It was an archive. Someone had hidden an entire record of the school's buried life beneath the place where children once sang songs, performed plays, and received awards. Mason knelt beside the nearest box and opened the first folder. Bank records. Not one or two, but dozens organized by year. He opened another. Accounting ledgers. Another contained district grant approvals, food program budgets, library renovation requests, transportation reimbursements, and invoices for supplies that had apparently never arrived. The more Mason read, the more the pattern sharpened. Money had been approved for classrooms that were never built. Funds had been released for books that never reached shelves. Lunch program payments had been processed for meals children never received. A library renovation had been billed 3 separate times under different contractor names. Mason felt a slow anger build in his chest, not loud, not reckless, but cold and steady. He had seen men steal before. He had seen corruption overseas, watched powerful people treat ordinary lives like numbers on paper. But this was different. These records were not abstract. They belonged to children. They belonged to hungry kids, cold kids, bright kids who needed books, safe classrooms, and adults who were supposed to protect them. Eleanor Price had not exaggerated on the tape. They were not stealing from the school. They were stealing from the children. Near the back of the room, Mason found several documents with burned edges, as if someone had tried to destroy them in a hurry but failed to finish the job. He laid them carefully across a crate and compared the names. Some were faded, others nearly unreadable. But a few appeared again and again. County officials, education board members, contractors, and financial institutions connected to old Willow Creek accounts. A false contract listed a construction company that had supposedly repaired the school roof in 1984. Mason had walked under that same roof. It had not been repaired in decades. Another invoice claimed payment for new library shelves. Mason thought of the rotting shelves upstairs, the locked bookcase hiding Eleanor's first warning, and clenched his jaw. Then Titan barked once, sharp and controlled. Mason turned. The dog stood near a half-buried pile of debris in the corner, pawing carefully at something beneath the dust. Mason crossed the room and helped clear away broken wood and old insulation. Underneath lay a small metal object, tarnished with age but still recognizable. A badge. Not a police badge, but an old enamel badge from the Willow Creek Board of Education. Mason wiped it with his thumb. A name was engraved on the back, Thomas Mercer. For a moment, the tunnel seemed to fall silent around him. Mercer. The name landed heavily because Mason already knew the current sheriff's name from the county paperwork he had signed at auction. Owen Mercer. Mason examined the badge again, forcing himself not to jump too quickly to conclusions. A badge beneath the school did not prove guilt, it proved connection. But combined with the ledgers, contracts, and Eleanor's fear, it pointed in a direction Mason could no longer ignore. He gathered the badge, several key records, the burned documents, and 2 ledgers into his pack. But before he could leave, Titan moved again. The dog did not bark this time. He walked to the far wall of the underground room and pressed his nose against a cabinet that had rusted shut. Mason followed, pried it open with a metal bar, and found a smaller folder wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was a list of student names, dozens of them. Beside each name were notes in Eleanor's handwriting. Needed winter coat, lunch account unpaid, reading level improving, mother lost job, father disabled, wants to become nurse, needs glasses. Mason sat back on his heels, suddenly unable to move. These were not financial documents. They were proof that Eleanor had known every child as a person. She had not been protecting numbers. She had been protecting futures. Rehook. As Mason turned the final page of the student list, a small photograph slipped from between the papers and landed face up on the dusty floor. It showed Eleanor Price standing on the auditorium stage with a group of children around her, all smiling beneath paper stars hung from the curtains. On the back, in Eleanor's handwriting, were 7 words. If they silence me, protect their future. Mason stared at the sentence while Titan lowered his head beside the photograph and gave that same quiet whine from the fence, the same sound that had first pulled Mason toward the school. For a few seconds, the tunnel no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like a promise someone had left behind because she believed, somehow, someday, somebody would care enough to find it. Mason stayed underground until his flashlight battery began to weaken. By the time he climbed back through the trapdoor with Titan behind him, the auditorium above felt different. The stage was no longer just old wood and dust. It was a threshold between what the town had chosen to believe and what had actually happened beneath its feet. Mason closed the trapdoor carefully and concealed it for the night. He was halfway across the auditorium when a sound from outside made him stop. A vehicle door closing. Titan froze instantly. Mason moved toward the side exit, keeping the evidence pack close against his shoulder. Outside, the schoolyard lay under a dark blue evening sky. Near the fence stood a sheriff's SUV, headlights off, engine quiet. Beside it stood a man Mason had not met yet, but recognized immediately from the badge on his chest. Sheriff Owen Mercer was 58, tall and broad, with a solid build that had softened slightly with age. His square face carried deep lines around the mouth and eyes, and a thick silver mustache sat above a jaw clenched too tightly to seem casual. His short gray hair was neatly cut, his tan sheriff uniform clean, his silver badge polished, but his dark blue eyes looked tired in a way Mason understood. This was a man carrying something heavy. Mercer watched Mason and Titan emerge from the school. His gaze dropped briefly to Mason's evidence pack, then returned to his face. "You're out late," the sheriff said. His voice was calm, but there was strain beneath it. Mason did not answer immediately. Titan stood beside him, silent and alert, body angled between Mason and the sheriff. Mercer noticed that too. "I heard you." "Bought the school," he continued. "That was a mistake." Mason held the sheriff's gaze. "Depends what someone wanted left inside it." The words changed Mercer's expression for less than a second, but Mason caught it. Fear. Not surprise. Fear. Mercer looked past him toward the dark building. "You need to stop digging around in things you don't understand." Mason thought of the student list, the missing grants, the burned contracts, Eleanor's photograph, and the badge bearing the name Thomas Mercer. "I understand enough to know Eleanor Price didn't steal from those kids," he said. The sheriff's face tightened. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Then explain it." Mercer did not. The silence between them stretched long enough to become an answer. For a moment, Owen Mercer looked less like a threat and more like a man trapped between the dead and the living. His father's name had been buried beneath the school, but the shame of it seemed to have followed the son into the present. Mason could see the struggle in him, and that made the warning more unsettling, not less. Bad men usually threatened with confidence, guilty men threatened with fear. Mercer stepped closer, lowering his voice so the empty schoolyard seemed to lean in around them. "Some truths," he said, "can destroy more than the guilty." Then he turned away, walked back to his SUV, and left without another word. Mason stood under the darkening Montana sky, watching the taillights disappear down the road. Titan remained at his side, still staring after the vehicle. Mason looked back at Willow Creek Elementary, its broken windows reflecting the last of the evening light. The tunnel had given him evidence. Mercer had given him confirmation. Whatever Eleanor Price had uncovered 40 years ago had not died with her disappearance. It had survived in ledgers, lies, and frightened men. And now, whether Willow Creek wanted it or not, it was beginning to surface. Mason did not leave Willow Creek after Sheriff Owen Mercer's warning. If anything, the warning made the silence around the abandoned school feel louder. By sunrise, he was back inside the auditorium with Titan lying near the stage, sorting through the records recovered from the tunnel beneath the school. The dog's amber eyes followed every movement, quiet but alert, as if he understood that the papers spread across the dusty floor were no longer just old documents. They were pieces of stolen childhoods. Mason read through bank statements, grant approvals, forged invoices, and burned contracts until the pattern became impossible to ignore. Money had been approved for books that never arrived, classrooms that were never built, cafeteria programs that never fed a single child, and library repairs that existed only on paper. He had seen corruption before in war zones, but this felt colder. These men had not stolen from enemies, governments, or distant institutions. They had stolen from children who needed lunch, coats, safe desks, and a reason to believe adults could be trusted. One name kept appearing in the old ledgers: Hale. Sometimes it was Richard Hale, sometimes Hale Community Bank, sometimes only a signature that looked like a hurried letter H beside transfers Eleanor Price had circled in red ink. Mason leaned back, rubbing the bridge of his nose, while Titan lifted his head and looked toward the town beyond the broken windows. The dog had led him under the school. Now the records were leading him somewhere else. The Hale Bank stood near the old railroad road on the western edge of Willow Creek, abandoned behind a row of cottonwoods that had grown wild over the decades. Its brick walls were dark with age, its front windows boarded, its brass door handles green with corrosion. Mason parked across the street and studied the building before entering. Titan stood beside him, black and dark-tanned fur moving in the cold wind, ears raised, scarred right ear twitching once toward the silent bank. The building had once been respectable, the kind of place where farmers signed loans, teachers cashed paychecks, and town leaders shook hands under polished lights. Now it looked like every lie inside had finally rotted through the walls. Mason found a side entrance where the frame had warped enough to pry open. Inside, dust-covered teller counters, old deposit slips lay scattered across the floor, and faded portraits of Hale family founders still hung crookedly behind the main desk. Mason searched for nearly an hour, but the obvious rooms had already been emptied. Filing cabinets were open, drawers were gone, safes were missing. Whoever had abandoned the place had taken care to remove anything easy to find. That was when Mason remembered something Grace had told him. When official records disappeared in Willow Creek, old newspapers often told the truth better than government files. By noon, he was at the town library asking for Lydia Crane. Lydia Crane was 64, small-framed, quick-eyed, and sharper than most people half her age. Her short silver hair framed a narrow face with warm brown eyes, behind reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She wore a burgundy cardigan, cream blouse, dark brown skirt, and the expression of a woman who had spent her life watching careless people underestimate librarians. Lydia had worked at the Willow Creek Public Library for almost 40 years, and she loved history with the protective intensity of someone who knew how easily communities edited their own shame. When Mason mentioned Eleanor Price, Lydia did not smile, but she did not turn away either. "Most people came here to forget her," she said, leading him into the archive room. "I kept everything because forgetting is how bad men win twice." She pulled old newspaper boxes from metal shelves, and for hours Mason sat beside Titan while Lydia laid out clippings about school grants, construction promises, public board meetings, charity drives, and sudden project cancellations. The articles told the same story as the ledgers, but with faces attached. Richard Hale, Victor Hale's father, appeared again and again beside education board members, county officials, and Thomas Mercer, the father of Sheriff Owen Mercer. Smiling men, good suits, public speeches, promises for children. Then silence. No classrooms, no renovated library, no expanded lunch program, no investigation after Eleanor vanished. Rehook near the South Sea. Bottom of one archive box, Lydia found a photograph from a ribbon-cutting ceremony that had never actually led to a completed building. Eleanor stood at the edge of the frame, not smiling, arms folded across her navy cardigan, watching Richard Hale shake Thomas Mercer's hand. Titan suddenly rose from the floor, walked to the table, and pressed his nose to the photograph, not to Eleanor, not to the crowd, but to the hand of a man standing behind Richard Hale, a younger man with gray eyes and a careful smile. Lydia inhaled sharply. "That's Victor," she whispered. He was only in his 20s then, but he was already learning where the bodies were buried. Mason looked at the young man's face, then at Titan, whose ears had gone rigid. The dog could not understand a newspaper clipping, but he understood Mason's tension, Lydia's fear, and maybe the old scent of paper stored in a place connected to the same people who had buried the truth. For the first time, Mason understood that Victor Hale was not just the son of a guilty man. He might be the man still protecting the lie. Lydia found one more useful document, an old property survey showing a basement storage level beneath Hale Community Bank, sealed off after a flood in the late 1980s. Mason returned to the bank before dusk with a pry bar, rope, flashlight, and Titan at his side. The entrance to the lower level was hidden behind warped paneling in a rear office, almost completely covered by old shelving. It took nearly 40 minutes to clear enough debris to open it. Cold air rose from the stairwell, carrying the smell of mildew, paper, and metal. Titan descended first, cautious but determined. The basement was larger than the survey suggested, with concrete walls, old shelving, collapsed boxes, and water stains reaching halfway up the walls. Mason expected emptiness. Instead, Titan led him to a heavy steel safe, half concealed behind broken office furniture. The dog sat in front of it, perfectly still. Mason spent almost an hour opening it, using tools from his truck and patience learned from years of field work. When the door finally swung open, he found what someone had believed would remain hidden forever: transfer lists, letters between officials, duplicate account ledgers, and envelopes marked with dates matching Eleanor's final months at the school. The documents confirmed that Richard Hale had helped move education funds through private accounts. Thomas Mercer had used his school board position to approve false invoices, and others in Willow Creek had signed off on projects they knew would never exist. But one set of letters changed the weight of the room. They showed that Owen Mercer, years later, had discovered fragments of the truth after his father's death. He had not committed the original crime, but he had known enough to understand Eleanor had been framed, and he had stayed silent. Mason carried copies of the most important documents to the Veterans Memorial near the courthouse the next afternoon, where Owen Mercer agreed to meet him away from the sheriff's office. Mercer arrived without his hat, looking older than he had the night before. In daylight, the sheriff's face showed every year of what he had carried, the deep lines around his tired blue eyes, the square jaw clenched from habit, the silver mustache hiding a mouth that seemed to have forgotten how to relax. Mason placed the letters on the stone bench between them. Mercer looked down and went pale. "You found the bank," he said. It was not a question. Mason answered quietly, "You knew." Mercer stared at the papers for a long time. "I found some of it after my father died," he said. "Not all. Enough." His voice roughened. "I told myself the men who did it were old or dead. I told myself reopening it would destroy families who had nothing to do with what happened." Mason thought of Eleanor's student list, of children needing coats and lunches, and replied, "The children already paid for those families' silence." Mercer closed his eyes. For a moment the sheriff no longer looked like a man guarding power. He looked like a son ashamed of loving a father whose hands were dirty. "I was afraid," he admitted, "afraid of what it would do to my name, afraid of what it would do to this town." Neither man noticed the black sedan parked half a block away, engine idling beneath the shade of a bare maple tree. Inside sat Victor Hale, 63, years old, thin and polished in a charcoal gray suit, white shirt, dark burgundy tie, and black leather shoes so clean they seemed untouched by Willow Creek dust. His silver-black hair was combed back perfectly, his face narrow with high cheekbones and cold gray eyes that revealed nothing he did not choose to reveal. Victor had inherited more than money from his father. He had inherited the habit of appearing respectable while quietly controlling what others were allowed to know. From the car, he watched Mason hand Mercer copies of the letters. He watched the sheriff bend beneath the weight of them. Then, Victor made one phone call and spoke only 3 words. "Burn it tonight." The call came just after dark. Mercer's phone rang while Mason was loading the evidence into his truck outside the school. The sheriff answered, listened, and turned sharply toward the east. Mason smelled smoke before Mercer said anything. Titan barked once, sharp and fierce, then leapt toward the truck door. In the distance, beyond the empty road and rusted fence, orange light began pulsing behind the windows of Willow Creek Elementary. Mason's stomach tightened. He drove fast, gravel spitting under the tires, while smoke rolled into the Montana night. When they reached the school, flames were already crawling across the library wing and licking toward the auditorium roof. The same library where Eleanor had hidden her first warning. The same auditorium where the tunnel waited beneath the children's stage. People gathered along the street whispering in horror, but Mason heard only Titan's frantic barking and the roar of fire tearing through old wood. Someone had waited until he came too close. Someone had decided the truth should burn before it could breathe. Mason stepped from the truck, heat striking his face, evidence box clutched under one arm, while Titan stood beside him with every muscle ready. The school was burning, and Mason knew without doubt that this was no accident. The fire reached the library faster than anyone expected. By the time Mason crossed the schoolyard, flames were already bursting through shattered windows and climbing the outer walls like living creatures determined to erase every secret hidden inside Willow Creek Elementary. Smoke rolled across the night sky, turning the stars into faint shadows. Sirens echoed through town as volunteers and firefighters rushed toward the scene, but Mason's attention remained fixed on one thing: the evidence. Years of military training had taught him how quickly information could disappear. Buildings could be rebuilt, reputations could recover, evidence destroyed by fire often vanished forever. Titan stayed beside him, barking sharply as sparks drifted across the parking lot. The 8-year-old German shepherd looked enormous beneath the flashing emergency lights. His black and dark tan coat reflected orange from the flames, and his amber eyes never left the burning library wing. "Stay close," Mason said. Then he ran inside. Heat slammed into him immediately. The hallway had already become an oven. Smoke filled the upper portion of the corridor, forcing him to stay low as he moved toward the library. Parts of the ceiling groaned overhead. Burning debris crashed somewhere deeper inside the building. Every instinct told him to leave. Instead, he pushed forward. The hidden tunnel evidence remained safe inside his truck, but several original records still sat inside the library archive area. If the fire destroyed them, proving Eleanor's innocence would become much harder. Mason wrapped a sleeve across his mouth and entered the library. Flames consumed the far side of the room. Books burned in long rows. Shelves collapsed one after another. The sight felt strangely tragic. Children had once learned here, dreamed here, prepared for futures that someone had stolen. Now the room itself was dying. Mason reached the archive table and grabbed everything he could carry. Old folders, copies of records, several photographs, Eleanor's journal. The heat intensified. A loud cracking sound echoed overhead. His military instincts screamed a warning. Too late. Part of the ceiling collapsed. A massive beam crashed between Mason and the exit. The floor shook violently. Dust exploded through the air. For a second, he couldn't see anything. Then pain shot through his injured knee as debris struck his leg. Mason stumbled backward. The path out was gone. Flames spread rapidly around the fallen beam. The library had become a trap. Outside, Titan began barking wildly. Not ordinary barking, panic. The kind of barking Mason had heard only a handful of times in nearly a decade together. Mason searched desperately for another route. Smoke thickened. His eyes watered. Breathing became difficult. The building groaned again. Then he saw movement. Titan. The dog had forced his way through a broken side window. Glass covered the floor beneath his paws. Ignoring the danger, Titan ran directly toward Mason. The German Shepherd grabbed the sleeve of Mason's uniform and pulled. Hard. Mason understood immediately. The dog had found a way out. Together, they moved toward the shattered window. Another section of ceiling collapsed behind them. The library exploded with sparks. Heat washed over Mason's back. Titan pulled again, one final step, then another. A moment later, they crashed through the opening and rolled into the grass outside. Less than 10 seconds later, the section of roof above the library collapsed completely. The crowd gasped. Several firefighters shouted. Mason lay on the ground coughing while Titan stood over him protectively. For a few seconds, neither moved. Then Mason reached up and placed a hand against the dog's neck. "Good boy." Titan licked his hand once. The simple gesture carried more emotion than words ever could. Firefighters took control of the scene soon afterward. Water blasted against the building. Smoke filled the air. The school continued burning. Most people believed the night was over. Titan disagreed. The dog suddenly stood. His ears lifted. His nose worked furiously. Then he started moving. Fast. Not toward the crowd, not toward the fire engines, toward the rear of the library. Mason followed immediately. Titan crossed the grass behind the building and stopped near an old ventilation opening, partially hidden beneath weeds and rusted metal. The dog began digging. Furiously, his paws scattered dirt and ash. At first, Mason saw nothing unusual. Then Titan barked, once, twice. Mason knelt beside him. Behind the rusted vent sat something dark wedged inside the opening. A bag. Not an ordinary bag. A fire-resistant document pouch. The material looked old but intact. Carefully, Mason pulled it free. His pulse quickened. The zipper remained sealed. The contents had survived. Inside were several items wrapped in waterproof plastic, a cassette tape, bank records, a list of names, and a letter. The handwriting on the envelope made Mason freeze. Eleanor Price. For a long moment he simply stared. Then he opened the letter. The paper inside had yellowed with age. Yet the writing remained clear. The message was addressed to Grace Holloway. Eleanor explained that she feared powerful people within Willow Creek had discovered her investigation. She believed someone was watching her. More importantly, she believed the evidence hidden beneath the school might someday disappear. If that happened, she wrote, the backup package hidden near the library vent would remain. Eleanor had prepared for exactly this possibility. She knew they might come for the school. She knew they might come for her. And she refused to let the truth die. Rehook Titan suddenly lowered his head toward the cassette tape and gave another soft whine. The same sound he had made the day he first saw the abandoned school. The same sound he made beside Eleanor's photograph. For a brief moment, Mason found himself wondering whether the dog had been following more than a scent all this time. Not something supernatural, something simpler. A trail left behind by a woman who had spent her final days trying to protect children she would never see grow up. Titan couldn't understand corruption. He couldn't understand politics, but he understood people. And somehow he had followed Eleanor's last attempt to tell the truth. Back at his truck, Mason used a portable cassette player to listen to the recovered recording. Unlike the damaged tape from the library, this one was complete. Eleanor's voice emerged clearly, tired, frightened, determined. Over the next 20 minutes, she revealed everything. She described discovering fraudulent education grants. She identified Richard Hale and several board members involved in moving money through false projects. She explained how Thomas Mercer helped approve documents that concealed the theft. She described threats, pressure, attempts to force her silence. Most importantly, she named the people responsible for destroying her reputation. The accusation of embezzlement had never been an investigation. It had been a strategy, a lie designed to isolate her before she could expose them. By the end of the recording, Mason finally understood what happened 40 years earlier. Eleanor had never stolen from anyone. She had been the only person willing to fight for the children. The final item inside the pouch was a handwritten list. Every major participant appeared on it: board members, financial intermediaries, business owners, county officials. Enough evidence to destroy the false story Willow Creek had believed for decades. Enough evidence to restore Eleanor's name. Enough evidence to expose everyone who helped bury the truth. Dawn approached as Mason finished reviewing the material. The school continued smoldering behind him. Parts of the building still stood. Parts never would again. Yet despite the destruction, the truth had survived. Titan lay beside the truck, exhausted but awake. The German shepherd watched the horizon while the first light touched the Montana plains. Mason looked at the evidence spread across the hood, then toward town. For 40 years, lies had controlled Willow Creek. For 40 years, children had paid the price. That ended now. He gathered the documents carefully. Tomorrow he would not investigate. Tomorrow he would not search. Tomorrow he would make sure the entire town heard the truth. And this time, nobody would be able to bury it again. The morning after the fire, Willow Creek no longer looked like a town hiding from its past. It looked like a town that had been forced awake. Smoke still drifted from the ruined library wing of Willow Creek Elementary, thin and gray against the pale Montana sky, while Mason Reed stood beside his truck with Eleanor Price's final evidence spread across the hood. The complete cassette tape, the backup bank records, the list of names, the letter to Grace Holloway, and the documents from the Hale Bank formed a story no rumor could bury anymore. Titan sat beside him, exhausted but alert, his black and dark tan coat still carrying the smell of smoke, his amber eyes watching the town road as if he knew the hardest part was not finding the truth, but making people face it. By noon, word had spread that Mason was calling a public meeting at the Willow Creek Town Hall. Some came out of curiosity. Some came because they were afraid. Some came because they had spent 40 years wondering if the story about Eleanor Price had ever made sense. Grace Holloway arrived early, wrapped in her light brown coat over a moss-green sweater, her silver-white hair neatly brushed, her pale blue eyes steady despite the trembling in her hands. Lydia Crane came behind her, carrying archive boxes full of old newspapers, the small, retired librarian moving with surprising speed and purpose, reading glasses bouncing against her burgundy cardigan. Sheriff Owen Mercer entered last among the familiar faces, tall and square-shouldered in his tan uniform, silver mustache hiding a mouth pressed into a line of dread. He did not stand beside Mason. He did not hide either. He sat in the front row like a man who had finally grown too tired to keep running from his own silence. Mason began without drama. He did not raise his voice, did not accuse the town as a whole, and did not try to make himself the hero of anything. He simply laid the evidence out in order. First came Eleanor's journal and the student notes showing coats bought, lunches paid, books purchased, and scholarships arranged with her own money. Then came the grant approvals and bank records, proving that millions intended for classrooms, library repairs, meal programs, and poor students had been diverted through false projects and shell accounts. Lydia stood beside him and matched old newspaper announcements to projects that were never completed. Grace quietly confirmed that those classrooms had never been built, those library shelves had never arrived, and those children had gone without while powerful men smiled in public photographs. The room grew quieter. With every page Mason turned. People who had spent decades repeating Eleanor's guilt now stared at the proof of her care. Then Mason placed the cassette recorder on the table and pressed play. Static filled the hall, followed by Eleanor Price's voice, clear and tired and unbearably human. She named Richard Hale. She named board members. She named Thomas Mercer's role in approving false documents. She explained how the accusation against her had been prepared before she disappeared, how her reputation had to be destroyed so nobody would listen when she told the truth. By the time the tape reached the line, "They are not stealing from the school. They are stealing from the children." Several people in the room were crying. The rehook came when Mason unfolded Eleanor's final letter to Grace. He expected the room to listen with sadness, but something deeper happened. Grace stood before he could read it aloud and asked to do it herself. Her hands trembled as she took the paper, but her voice became stronger with every word. Eleanor had not written like a woman planning to run. She had written like a woman preparing to be silenced. She wrote about the students by name, about the hungry boy who wanted to become a doctor, the girl who read under the hallway light because her house had no electricity, the twins who shared one winter coat, and the child who had once asked if poor kids deserved new books too. When Grace reached the final sentence, her voice broke. "If I cannot protect my name, please protect their future." No one moved. Even Titan, lying beside Mason's boots, lifted his head and stared toward the front of the hall. In that silence, Eleanor Price stopped being a scandal. She became a woman again, a teacher, a protector, and a witness who had waited 40 years for her words to find the living. After the letter, Sheriff Wilfrey, Owen Mercer rose slowly. The room turned toward him with the kind of silence that leaves no place to hide. For years, Owen had worn the badge like a shield, but in that moment it looked heavier than armor. He stepped to the front, facing Grace first, then Mason, then the people of Willow Creek. His voice came low, rough, and uneven. He admitted that after his father, Thomas Mercer, died, he found fragments of old correspondence and records that suggested Eleanor had been framed. He admitted he had not known everything at first, but he had known enough to question the official story. He admitted he was afraid that exposing the truth would ruin his father's name, break families, and reopen wounds the town had pretended were healed. "I told myself silence was mercy," he said, eyes red but steady. It wasn't. It was cowardice. He did not ask forgiveness. That made the confession feel real. He only turned toward Grace and said, "Eleanor deserved better from this town, and from me." Across the room, Victor Hale sat rigid in a charcoal gray suit, his silver-black hair combed perfectly back, his cold gray eyes no longer unreadable but cornered. When Mason presented the bank documents proving Victor had continued concealing records after his father's death and had likely ordered the school fire, the sheriff did what he should have done years earlier. Owen Mercer turned toward his deputies and ordered Victor Hale detained pending state investigation. Victor did not shout. Men like him rarely did when masks fell. He simply stood, straightened his burgundy tie, and looked at Mason with hatred disguised as dignity. By sunset, Willow Creek had changed. Not completely, not magically, not all at once, but the first fracture in the lie had become daylight. The county issued a formal statement reopening Eleanor Price's case. State investigators arrived within days. The story spread beyond Willow Creek. Former students began writing letters, then sending photographs, then returning to town. Some remembered Eleanor paying for lunch. Some remembered new shoes left quietly in classroom cubbies. Some remembered her staying late so children with nowhere safe to go could wait inside the school until a parent came. The state later recovered part of the stolen funds through Hale family assets and old financial holdings. Civic groups, former students, teachers, veterans, and strangers who heard the story began donating to rebuild Willow Creek Elementary. It took nearly 2 years because justice is rarely fast when damage has been allowed to live for 40 years. The burned library wing had to be removed, the auditorium had to be stabilized, asbestos had to be cleared. New classrooms rose where rot and silence had lived. Through it all, a bronze plaque was prepared for the front entrance. Eleanor Price, principal, teacher, protector of children. Beneath her name were the words from her final letter: protect their future. On the first day, Willow Creek Elementary reopened. The town gathered not in shame, but in gratitude. Children ran across the new playground where rusted swings had once hung crooked in the wind. Parents took pictures. Teachers stood at the doors with tears in their eyes. Grace Holloway, now moving slower but smiling brighter than Mason had ever seen her, placed one hand against Eleanor's plaque and whispered something only she could hear. Lydia Crane stood nearby with a folder of restored photographs for the school archive. Owen Mercer attended without his sheriff's badge that morning. He had stepped down during the investigation, choosing testimony over reputation at last. He looked older, but lighter. Mason watched from near his truck, dressed in the same green camouflage uniform and tan boots that had carried him into the first night of the mystery. Titan sat beside him, collar polished, brass name tag catching the morning sun. The dog looked toward the school doors as children poured inside, ears relaxed, tail moving slowly against the ground. Then a little girl broke from the crowd and ran toward them. Mara Whitcomb was 10 years old, small and bright-faced, with light brown hair and 2 braids, blue eyes, a light blue hoodie, denim overalls, and white sneakers already dusty from the playground. Mason had seen her once before, walking to a bus stop before dawn because the nearest school had been miles away. Now she stopped in front of him, breathless and smiling. "My mom said, you helped give us our school back," she said. Mason looked down at Titan. "He found it first." Mara knelt and hugged Titan around the neck. The old K9 stood very still, then wagged his tail once, gentle as a promise. A bell rang above the front entrance. For the first time in 40 years, Willow Creek Elementary called children to class. The sound traveled across the rebuilt yard, across the town, across the place where a lie had once stolen more than money. Mason felt something loosen inside him, something tied to war, loss, and the fear that purpose had ended when his service did. He had not come to Willow Creek looking for a mission. Titan had found one for him. Mason placed a hand on the dog's head and watched the last child disappear through the school doors. Grace waved from near the plaque. Lydia smiled through tears. Owen Mercer stood alone beneath a maple tree, head bowed, accepting both shame and relief. Mason climbed into the truck, and Titan jumped into the passenger seat with the practiced ease of a partner ready for the next road. As they drove out of Willow Creek, the school bell rang again behind them, clear and bright in the morning air. A secret buried for 4 decades had finally ended. A good woman had her name returned. Children had their school again. And one loyal dog had followed a trail no one else believed in until the truth came back into the light. As this story comes to an end, perhaps the greatest miracle was never the hidden evidence, the forgotten records, or even the truth that survived for 40 years. Perhaps the greatest miracle was that God never allowed the truth to be lost forever. For decades, Eleanor Price was remembered as a criminal by people who never knew what truly happened. Her reputation was destroyed, her life's work was forgotten, and an entire community accepted a lie as fact. Yet God sees what people cannot see. He remembers what the world forgets, and in His perfect timing, the truth found its way back into the light. Sometimes in our own lives, we face seasons that feel unfair. We may be misunderstood, falsely judged, overlooked, or burdened by struggles that seem impossible to overcome. We may wonder if anyone notices our sacrifices or our pain. But this story reminds us that God is always working, even when we cannot see it. What is hidden today may be revealed tomorrow. What is broken today may be restored someday. And what feels lost may simply be waiting for God's perfect moment. Mason did not arrive in Willow Creek searching for a purpose. Titan did not know he was about to change the lives of countless people, yet God used an ordinary man and a loyal dog to restore a good woman's honor, give children back their future, and heal a wound that had existed for generations. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder from heaven. Sometimes they arrive one faithful step at a time. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. We would love to hear what lesson you learned from this journey. Has God ever answered a prayer in a way you did not expect? Has faith helped you through a difficult season? Share your story with our community. Please share this video with someone who may need encouragement today. And if you enjoy stories about faith, courage, loyalty, justice, and second chances, subscribe to Seal K9 Horizon so you won't miss our next story. Before you leave, we invite you to join us in a simple prayer. May God bless you and your family. May He protect your home, guide your steps, strengthen your heart in difficult times, and fill your life with peace, hope, and purpose. May He watch over those you love, provide for those who are struggling, heal those who are hurting, and remind each of us that we are never truly alone. Remember this: when people forget, God remembers. When the world gives up, God still has a plan. When darkness seems strongest, His light is often closer than we realize. Thank you for being part of the Seal K9 Horizon family. May God bless you, and may His grace go with you wherever your journey leads next.